All right, I think we're live here. I'll wait a minute for people to get in. It's going faster today. What's going on, guys? Just getting everything ready here. I think we're going to have our first actual live stream. Going to cover all of the games from the best games rather, from rounds number 1 through 5 of the Freestyle Chess Grand Slam tournament, which is happening right now. So, anything you guys want to say, go ahead and comment in the chat. I'm about to get started here. What is up, Itachi? How's it going, man? Cool to see this is actually working. It's my first live stream, so welcome. Not my first. I had one yesterday, but didn't work out so well. So anyway, you know, I'll be reading chats kind of in between games. It'll be a little bit hard to read all the chats as I'm going. Good, all right. So I've got, I believe, 4 games I want to cover. 4 to 5 games here from the Freestyle Chess Tournament. So let's see, anything else? All right, I'm going to dive right in here. All right, the first game for today is Magnus Carlsen versus Hikaru Nakamura. This game happened in round number 1 of the Freestyle Chess Tournament. This was a crazy game with a crazy finish. And as you can see, Freestyle Chess, so all the pieces are on very strange squares. We have the knights in the corner of the board, the bishops in the center, and the queens, kings, and rooks all on the left side. Now, let's see how Magnus wants to start this game. In the game, he does open 1d4, and I do want to point out, instead of 1d4, the best moves here, according to the engine, are d4, e4, f4, and the alpha 0 move a4. Instead, 1d4 chosen in the game, and black does the same, 1d5. Then here on move 2, Magnus going to f3, potentially intending a fast e4 break, and you don't see it very often in classical chess, but I guess it works out here in freestyle chess. And how is black going to respond? He plays a very curious looking move, bishop b5, flying out with the bishop. The idea being, if white goes e4, then you lose the bishop on the f1 square as that bishop is pinned. However, overall, this move, bishop b5, is not that strong. And here white simply goes a4, gaining space on the queen side, driving back that bishop. Where is it going to go? It goes bishop a6. Now, again, that pawn on e2 is still pinned to the bishop on f1. That is the idea behind this sequence. All right, from here, Magnus continues, knight to f2, developing his knight to that f2 square that was made vacant by the move f3, and black is going to respond with the move knight to g6, jumping out with his knight, a very decent idea. Now Magnus, knight d3, traveling over with the knight, the idea being now that pawn on e2 is free to enter the board. It is no longer pinned. And how is black going to respond? Well, he decides, you know what, it is time to get rid of that bishop. He goes bishop takes d3. Now white goes rook takes d3, recapturing, and now Hikaru, he finally breaks in the center of the board with the very provocative move e5. Now the idea being, if white takes on e5, the knight recaptures back, and then black is targeting the rook on the d3 square with that knight. That would be very, very strong. White in response goes e3, bolstering the pawn on the d4 square rather, and then we have knight to f6, jumping out with that knight. Now here Magnus, he gets very creative with this rook. He's a little bit concerned. He's concerned about the idea of, if you take on e5, black recaptures with the knight again, putting pressure on that rook on d3. b3. Therefore here, he actually plays the move rook to b3. The point being now white is setting up bishop to a6 ideas, and that pawn on b7 would be pinned to the king. I do want to point out though, there were plenty of other ideas instead of rook b3. For example, right here, the move g4, potentially intending g5, driving back that knight, is actually the top engine choice, but rook b3 is the second best engine move. Again, the idea being bishop to a6 coming up. And what is black going to do about it? Well, he goes a6. Now, normally you don't want to go a6 in this sort of scenario, as then bishop takes a6 would win the pawn. However, here, the rook on a8 does guard that a6 square. Therefore, if white takes on a6, then the rook takes back, and then black is up a piece. So instead, right here, white does go g4, gaining space on the king's side, threatening g5, threatening to push that knight back away from the f6 square. Now, what is black going to do in response? Well, he decides it is time to break on the queen's side, and he plays the very strong move c5. The point being now there is a tremendous amount of pressure on that pawn on d4, and this move is very strong. However, there were plenty of other ideas. For example, the computer quite likes the idea of king to a7 here, kind of a strange looking move. There are plenty of other weird ideas. E takes d4, also very playable, but instead c5 played in the game. Now again, we have just a tremendous amount of pressure on that pawn on d4. Where is that pawn going to go? What is white going to do? Well, you can lead the pawn on d4 and allow black to capture, or you can take on e5 or c5. In the game, the move d takes c5 was chosen by the goat, a perfectly fine move, and black again can recapture the bishop or the queen. In the game, queen takes c5 was chosen, activating the queen, but leaving that bishop back on the f8 square where it isn't doing a whole lot yet. All right, now Magnus, his big problem here. Well, number one, his rook on a1 and his king on b1 are a little bit awkwardly placed. Beyond that, the bishops on f1 and e1 are a little bit passive, and that knight on g1 also not doing a lot. So Magnus here has to get his back rank pieces into the game. So he starts knight to e2, potentially intending knight c3. That would be a very good square for that knight. And Hikaru has the same problem. He's got to get his pieces on the back row into the game. He goes bishop d6. Oops. Bishop to d6, developing his bishop, a perfectly fine move. However, there were plenty of other stronger alternatives. For example, king to a7, knight d7, and so on were a little bit better. Instead, bishop d6 chosen in the game, getting that last piece in. And now here, Magnus, instead of knight to c3, he actually goes the other way with the knight and goes knight g3. So, knight g3 played in the game, and this move is very interesting. Potentially, white wants to go knight f5, forking both the bishop on d6 and that pawn on g7, forcing something like bishop to f8. Again, there were plenty of other good alternatives. Rook c3, hitting the queen on c5 is very strong, as is g5, driving back that knight on f6. Instead, knight g3 chosen in the game, again, eyeing that very weak f5 square. And Garry Kasparov once said, a knight on f5 is worth at least a pawn, and that may be the case here. That knight would be a monster. And overall here, Magnus does seem to have a very large advantage out of the opening. Yes, black has those good pawns on e5 and d5, but overall, his pieces aren't coordinating that well, and white has a lot of pressure on the king, on the queen, the knight coming to f5, and so on. And what is black going to do? Well, he knows you simply cannot allow that knight to go to the f5 square. With that in mind, knight to e7 chosen in the game, guarding f5s with the knight. Now here, how does Magnus continue the attack? He goes rook to c3, sliding over the rook, pressuring that queen on c5. Now, of course, the queen is going to have to go somewhere, and it turns out the only good square for the queen, this is very awkward, is the a7 square. If you go anywhere else, white's going to have way too many aggressive ideas, potentially a5 and so on, rook a3 and so on, getting the attack going. So he does go queen to a7 in the game. Again, if you don't do that, white's going to have way too many ideas. Now here, white continues with the alpha 0 attack. He goes a5, clamping down on the queen side. Now this a pawn is technically a fighting piece. It controls b6. This makes ideas like b6 or b5 virtually impossible to achieve later in the game. And It's very interesting. The king started on b1 and b8, and they basically stayed there. And here, white has somehow managed to bring all of his pieces over here. The bishop slicing down the board, the rook slicing down the c files and the a files, the queen very close to entering the game as well. And Magnus has just a completely dominant position right here. All right, Hikaru, he goes bishop b4, pressuring the rook and skewering the bishop behind the rook. Now we have rook b3, and then Hikaru continues his idea. Bishop takes e1, and then queen takes e1 was played in the game. Now Hikaru, he's got to defend. He goes knight to c6, bringing his other piece over to the defense. Of course, that pawn on b7 defends the knight, but it is pinned to the king. Therefore, white has some ideas, potentially based on, say, queen to c3, targeting that knight on c6 immediately. Now, before doing that, he finds a very, what's the word for it? He finds a very aggressive move, g5, gaining space on the king's side. Now, this may have been a little bit premature. Instead of that, the more obvious move may have simply been knight to f5, jumping in with the knight to the very weak f5 square, targeting g7, but instead g5 played in the game. Hard to argue with this move, a very typical open Sicilian style move, again, driving back that knight. Now, d7 is the only decent square for that knight, and that is where it goes. Knight d7 chosen in the game. I mean, where else could you go? h5 is occupied, or not occupied, defended by the knight. The only other squares were e8 and g8, and overall d7 makes quite a bit more sense than those. And here, after a couple of slightly inaccurate moves by Magnus, Hikaru seems to have equalized according to the computer. Now here, how does white want to proceed? Well, there are a few different ideas the computer likes. For example, e4, f4, potentially knight to f5, and so on are all decent. Instead, though, in the game, bishop to h3 chosen, targeting that weak knight on the d7 square. Now, black continues. Queen to c5. Of course, that knight is defended for now. There's no need to over-defend that knight. And again, Magnus, he has to find some way to justify sort of his awkwardly placed pieces right here. Black still has that good central control, and unless white can get some sort of attack going, that central control will mean more in the long run. All right, from here, white continues another very strange move. Knight to h5, targeting the pawn on g7. Now, this looks active, but overall, the action is happening on the queen side here, where the kings are located, and this knight does risk being misplaced. Instead of that, there were plenty of other moves again. For example, rook a to a3. Developing the other rook may have been a little bit smarter. Now, of course, that pawn on g7 is being attacked. Hikaru respects that. He goes queen to f8, the best way to defend the knight. Instead, if you go, say, g6, that makes too many weaknesses on the dark squares on the king's side. For example, f6 and g7 are very, very weak in that scenario. Instead, queen to f8 played in the game, defending g7, a very precise move. And now, how does white want to continue in this position? Well, Magnus, he goes for it on the king side with the move f4. Very strong. He's potentially threatening something like f5, gaining even more space, trying to clamp down on that side of the board. And of course, there is a little bit of tension on that pawn on e5, but that shouldn't be anything for Hikaru to worry about too much. Now here, Hikaru, he just jumps in with his knight to c5, defending b7 in advance and pressuring the rook on b3, a very good multi-purpose move. And now Magnus says, you know what? We need to keep this rook on the b file. Rook to b6 played in the game. Now, that rook is very vulnerable. For example, a knight on perhaps d7 could target it later in the game, but there is no dark squared bishop, and overall, that means that rook will be relatively okay on that square. Now here, Hikaru, king to a7 is the move. We've seen this as a possibility throughout this game, and king to a7 here turns out to be quite a decent idea, not bad at all. Now, how does white want to continue? Well, here Magnus does trade on e5. F takes e5 played in the game, and black takes back on the e5 square. Knight takes e5 as well. Now we have queen to b4. Magnus flying out with the queen. The point being, you are defending that rook on b6 in advance and pressuring the pawn on b7. Decently active move, and of course there is this tension on the queens on this diagonal here. If that knight moves, the queens will be traded, but it's not a pin, as that queen on f8 is more than defended by these two rooks on the back rank. Alright, Hikaru, he continues. Rook a to b8, a prudent move, defending that pawn on b7 in advance. If you don't do that, things could get very, very bad, very, very fast for a variety of reasons. For example, you know, too many reasons to count. So instead, rook b8 played in the game, just defending b7 in advance. Now here, Magnus, he finds Kind of an insane looking move at first glance, but there's a very simple tactical idea behind it. He goes for the move knight takes g7. The point being, this queen on f8 is completely overloaded. If you take on g7, then the knight on c5 is going to fall immediately. For example, queen takes g7 would be met by queen takes c5, simply picking up that knight. So here Hikaru, he doesn't go for that. Instead, knight to c6 played in the game, retreating back with the knight and pressuring the queen on b4, as well as technically that pawn on a5. Now the queen has to move. Where should the queen go? In the game, queen to a3 chosen by Magnus Carlsen. And now Hikaru goes for a very critical central break in this position. He actually plays the move d4. The idea behind this, of course, if white takes on d4, black is going to take back either the knight or the rook and get a lot of activity. And as this game opens up, the white king on b1 is going to be more and more vulnerable. And that is what happens here. White takes on d4, and instead of recapturing with the knight, that makes a lot of sense. Instead, rook takes d4 played in the game. And now look at this. I mean, all of white's pieces are sort of awkwardly placed. They're not really doing a whole lot. And suddenly black, especially his two knights and his rook, his pieces are starting to get some activity. And you can see if the queen comes in, if the rook comes in, and so on, white's king on b1, it could be in a lot of trouble very, very quickly. And of course, Magnus knows that. And so he starts knight f5, getting his knight back into the game. Of course, that wasn't necessary, as whenever black takes on g7, white could take on c5, if I can draw arrows correctly. But overall, that knight on g7 simply wasn't doing a whole lot for white's position. Therefore, knight f5 makes a lot of sense. Now we have for Hikaru, rook to a4, flying over with the queen, pressuring the queen, and skewering the rook behind the queen. We have queen to g3, sliding over with the queen, and then sure enough, rook takes a1, and then king takes a1. Now here Hikaru, queen d8 is the move, sliding over with the queen, eyeing that g5 pawn, if I can draw arrows correctly, that g5 pawn. And of course, there's also the threat of queen d1 check, hitting the king. That could be dangerous. Now, the king does have the a2 square available for now, meaning that will not be an immediate checkmate. However, that will be very dangerous later in the game. Now here, Magnus, queen g1 is the move, respecting that threat. If I can get past this lag, queen g1 is the move, respecting the threat of queen d1 by Hikaru. And now Hikaru, queen d5, flying up with the queen, pressuring the a2 square and pressuring that knight on f5. Overall, Hikaru does seem to have kind of clawed back in this game so far. But of course, Magnus, he is not done attacking. And here, he busts out the very, very strong move b4, gaining space on the queen side. And now look at this. If this knight on c5 moves, then suddenly there's going to be all kinds of discovered attacks on the king. For example, if the knight goes to, I don't know, a4, then something like rook takes c6 would be very dangerous, as bang, the king would be exposed on this open diagonal. All right, the lag here is getting crazy. I can't seem to... I apologize for this, chess YouTube. The lag is not allowing the eval bar to move at all. This is getting quite annoying. I'm debating if I should just keep going or wait. Let me see what the chat says. Scott McLaughlin. Yeah, I'm trying out the live stream for the first time. I'm going to repost these as videos as well. But this is my first time trying out the live stream. So this eval bar is not cooperating at all. I have too much lag, so we're just going to keep going here. All right, in the game, queen to e5, chosen by Hikaru, targeting the king on the a1 square. Magnus goes king to a2, stepping out of the attack, and then Hikaru rook to c8, trying to get his rook activated. But here, white simply takes the knight on the c5 square. Again, the idea behind rook b8, if you don't do that, if you move the knight, say to e6 or anywhere else, then bang, rook takes c6, hits the knight and the king on the a7 square. So no matter what, you are simply losing material here as black. All right, b takes c5, chosen in the game. Then we have queen to c3 for Hikaru. Hikaru being down a piece officially. He is trying to hang on. He's doing his best. But of course, Magnus is going to make his life as difficult as possible. So rook b3 played in the game, targeting that queen on the c3 square. Now we have queen takes c2, gobbling up that free f3 pawn, king to a3. The king marches up, then knight takes a5. But of course now, with that knight not on the c6 square, suddenly that tactic of c6 is in the air. And here Magnus, he busts it out. c6 hitting the king. Now, if you take with the knight on c6, then you're going to be setting up for all kinds of ideas, most notably queen b7, forcing the king back, and then queen b7 would be checkmate on the spot. So instead, king b8 chosen in the game. Then we have queen to g3, flying up with the queen, targeting the king on the b8 square. Now, black goes rook to c7, trying to block the attack. Rook to c3, defends the pawn on c6, and targets the queen on the c2 square. Now, Hikaru, queen b1, sliding back with the queen. Then we have knight to d4, then b6, trying to defend, and then queen d6. Magnus slowly but surely closing in on the black king, and this is going to be a deadly finish right here. All right, queen to a1, targets that king on the c3 square. Then king to b4, the king marches up, knight to b7, Hikaru retreats the knight, and then here, the unbelievable finish to this game. Magnus Carlsen, you know what? Good time for a pause. If you like, pause the video right now and try to find the key idea for Magnus right here in this position. He flies back, queen to f8, targeting the king on b8. The king goes to a7, and now the final move of the game, of course, knight to b5. The idea being if black takes that knight on the b5 square, like for example, a takes b5, white simply goes rook to a3, forking the king and the queen. Black loses the queen, and then he's going to be down so much material. White's going to literally have, after queen takes, king takes, the queen and the bishop versus the rook and the knight. That is just too much material, and for that reason, way back in this position right here, Hikaru Nakamura simply resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen. Very impressive stuff. All right, check out the chat again. So I'm new to keep going. All right. Thanks. Thank you, Scott McLaughlin. Everyone, the chat's open. Comment down in the chat if you're watching this. So this was the first game. Man, the engine is being really annoying here. It does not want to load. So we're going into the second game. I have not analyzed the rest of the games yet, so I'm going to analyze them real fast with you guys and then run through the actual replay of it and whatnot. So I'm going to need like 5 minutes to do it. I'm not sure if I should be doing the analysis before the live stream or during. So if you guys have any suggestions, feel free to comment down below. And man, the engine here is just not cooperating for this next game. And by the way, this next game is going to be Gukesh versus Hikaru Nakamura. All right. Finally, it starts going. Let's see here. So I'm just doing some analysis on my own here. You know what? For this video, I think I'm going to skip doing the analysis ahead of time because this is so laggy. And we're just going to power through all of these incredible games real fast for you guys. So give me 1 sec. So where are you guys from? What's going on? Mohammed Drez Shari. My name's Mike Jansen. Scotland, all right. Yeah, I'm from United States originally. I'm actually living in the country of Panama in Latin America right now. Kind of a weird place to be, but that's where I'm at. So I don't know if you guys watch my videos or not. I've been doing videos for, I don't know, 8 or 9 months or so. And I'm going to start live streaming all of the videos for the tournaments. And then I'm going to repost the live stream as like individual videos you guys can watch later as well. So I'm just updating my layout here to reflect the new people. So Gukesh is going to play as white in this next game. So I'm just getting some pictures for you guys and whatnot for the videos and all that good stuff. Actually also facing Hikaru. That's pretty easy. So I've had some people in my comments section saying I'm not a real person, but I can assure you I am a real person and whatnot. Let's see what else everyone's saying here. Fide Master from Iran. All right. Way to go, Mohammad Rez. You're Mohammad Reza. I hope I'm saying your name right. Mohammad Reza. I've never heard that name. It's a very interesting name. Appreciate it. I'm a fan of you as well. Fide Master. I hope to be a Fide Master in the future. I'm going to start live streaming me playing online on the chess.com server soon. So, you know, we'll see if I can get my rating up. I'm going to use the bathroom. I'll be right back, guys. So this will just be playing for a minute here. I'll be right back. All right, we're back. We are back. Let's see what you guys are saying here. That will be cool. All right, thank you guys. Yeah, I'll see if I can get to that soon. I got a lot of YouTube projects that I'm doing and whatnot, but yeah, I'll see what I can do. All right. Oh, and so that's my rating. I'm rated about 2,000 on Lead Chess and like 1,700 to 1,800 on chess.com. So. You know, typical amateur player, nothing special. All right, so we got. Oh, didn't update the name. That is not what Gukesh looks. Gukesh D. There we go. All right, I think we are ready for the second game. All right, this game is Gukesh versus Hikaru Nakamura. I believe it was round number 2 of day number 1 of the Freestyle Chess tournament. So again, Freestyle Chess, all the pieces are on absolutely insane squares. We have the bishops on the left side of the board slicing down this way, the knights over on the right side of the board, and the king on D1 with the rooks on F1 and A1 and so on. And let's see, how does Gukesh want to begin this game? Well, here the strongest moves according to the engine are D3, F4, A3, and A4. And in the game, Gukesh, he goes F4 in the spirit of the bird's opening. Actually, quite a good move here. And Hikaru Nakamura, he does the exact same thing. F5, clamping down on that F pawn, clamping down on the E4 and the G4 squares. Now, Gukesh, D3 is the move, moving his king's pawn 1 square forward, potentially intending E4, gaining space in the center of the board. And now Hikaru Nakamura, he goes B6, intending potentially bishop B7 with the fianchetto of that light squared bishop slicing down this diagonal, but I'm not so sure about that move. All right, now Gukesh, knight to G3 is the move, jumping up with the knight, and very interestingly, the computer said A3 and A4 were the strongest moves, potentially intending a fast A5, trying to capitalize on that fianchetto-based setup of black. Now Hikaru, bishop B7 is the move, very logical, continuing with that fianchetto, and now Gukesh, he does gain space in the center, completing his idea with D3, with the move E4, a very strong move, gaining space, and now we have all this tension with these pawns on E4 and F5, and what is Hikaru going to do about it? Well, he goes F takes E4 immediately. That is the strongest idea, taking that pawn. Of course, white should... He doesn't take back. And normally you would think white would take back with the d-pawn or potentially the knight, but instead, Gukesh, he plays a very, very strange looking move in this position. He goes for the attack on the queen side with the move a4 with the alpha 0 pawn. Now I do want to point out, instead of that, knight takes e4 was the right response. Simply recapturing with the knight, there's nothing wrong with that. It'd be a game white would continue developing, but instead he goes for the insane move a4 here, gaining space. Crazy stuff. Is he potentially thinking a5 then a6? We'll have to wait and see. All right, Hikaru Nakamura. He goes He goes c5, gaining space on the queen side in the spirit of the Sicilian defense. And now here, Gukesh, he continues his idea of gaining space on the queen side with the move a5. This is just completely insane. I mean, this was not necessary. There were plenty of other ideas. And again, is white intending a takes b6 or the alpha 0 style move a6? Honestly, I'm not sure. We'll have to wait and see. Here, Hikaru says no more messing around. He finally does take on e4. F takes e4 is the move. And now Gukesh simply recaptures with the d-pawn. D takes e4. Now here, Hikaru, knight to d6, jumping up with the knight, pressuring that pawn on e4. And now let's count them. We have 1, 2 pieces attacking that pawn versus the 1 piece on g3 defending. That means black is threatening to win that pawn on e4 right away. But of course, Gukesh, he's got some very interesting ideas. Before defending it or going e5, he actually goes bishop to a2. This is one of the benefits of that move a4 then a5 earlier. You free up that a2 square where it can slice across the board and hit the queen. Now here, black goes queen to g7, fianchettoing the queen to get out of the attack. And I do want to point out, for some insane reason here, the computer says actually knight to c4 is the best way to get out of the attack, blocking the attack of the bishop with the knight. Excuse me. Now, personally, that move looks completely insane to me. Instead, queen g7 played in the game. That move looks far more logical. And here, white does go e5, gaining space in the center, driving back that knight. And overall, it does look like white has a very stable advantage so far in this position. All right, here, Hikaru Nakamura, knight to f5 is the move, jumping over with the knight and threatening knight takes g3, trying to damage white's pawn structure on the king side. That would be incredibly annoying. With that in mind here, white does trade on f5. So knight takes f5 played in the game. Then we have g takes f5, and then white gets his bishop on c1 out into the game on the e3 square. Bishop to e3, and now white is officially ready for long castles, whereas king would go to c1 and his rook to the d1 square, just as in classical chess. And now black does the exact same thing. He gets his king ready for castling, and now here both sides do castle long castles, and then long castles. And now it is starting to sort of a little bit resemble a more normal game of chess. Of course, a lot of the pieces are still on insane squares. That is just typical Freestyle Fridays chess for you. All right, here, knight to f3 played in the game, developing the knight to a decent square. Black goes h6, gaining control of g5 and stopping knight to g5 ideas. Now, here, in this position, Gukesh plays a very aggressive move. This move is completely insane. I mean, if you think you know what the move is, pause the video right now and try to find it. This turns out to be the strongest move in the position. That is your one hint. And it kickstarts a brutal queenside attack against the black king. And while you're at it, go and smash that YouTube like button for me. It really does help me out a ton. And here, Gukesh, it turns out he goes for it on the queen side with the move bishop takes c5. He's giving up the bishop for 2 pawns, the one on c5 and the one on b6 after b takes and then queen takes. Now, normally, the bishop is worth more than those 2 pawns, but here, of course, that black king on c8 is just incredibly vulnerable, and Gukesh is going to get a huge attack going on the queen side. All right, queen g6 chosen by Hikaru Nakamura. The idea being the queen now defends along the 6th rank. All of these squares are being guarded by the queen. That may be very important. For example, queen c6 in particular may be a very good idea. But of course, Gukesh, he calculated literally all of this out. He saw into the future. He saw the move queen g6. And here, he had the move ready, e6, blocking the 6th rank. And of course, the bishop on a2 guards that square. Therefore, queen takes e6 is not possible. Now here, you can do 3 things. Number 1, you can do nothing and allow e takes d7. Number 2, you can go d6. Number 3, you can go d takes e6. Either way, the queen is being cut off from the game on g6. That is the entire idea of that move. Now here, black has a few different decent ideas. The computer says a6, d takes e6, and finally d6 are the best moves for black. In the game, king to b8 instead was chosen, getting the king away from the pin. Now the bishop on c7 is no longer pinned to the king on the c8 square, as that king is no longer on c8. But here, Gukesh, he spots the flaw with this move. He jumps in with the knight to e5, just continuing the attack. Of course, there were some stronger ideas. I do want to point out here, the move a6 was incredibly strong. Instead, knight to e5 chosen in the game, and Hikaru says that knight on e5 is too strong to be kept alive. He takes it immediately. Bishop takes e5, then queen takes e5, wins back that piece, and then black simply goes d6, blocking the attack. And now, because white missed the idea of a6 just a couple of moves prior, Hikaru Nakamura has found a way to claw himself back into the game. Now from here, we had the move queen to b5, sliding over with the queen, once again pinning that bishop on b7 to the king on b8. And now the threat is bishop d5, targeting that pin piece on b7. And what is black going to do about it? Well, he slides back with the queen to e8, a very good move. Now, of course, there is no time for bishop d5, as then you would immediately lose that queen on the b5 square. Now we have queen to b4, Gukesh dropping back with the queen, maintaining the pin and maintaining the idea of bishop to d5. That would be very strong. And now black has a couple of ways to get out of that future attack. And one of them, a very good one played by black, is simply king to a8, sliding out of the pin. Now if white goes bishop d5, black can simply take that bishop immediately. And beyond that, black has rook to b8 ideas, which may be very, very useful. Now Gukesh, he's got to continue the attack. He is essentially all in here. He goes a6, giving up that pawn on the a6 square in order to try and open up more lines on the king side. And of course, that pawn cannot be taken at any cost. Here, if you take the pawn, bishop takes a6, then the move for white, it's very simple, bishop d5, and the only way to delay mate is either queen c6 or bishop b7. Either way, you are getting checkmated in short order. So instead of taking the pawn, Hikaru just goes bishop c6, moving up with the bishop. Now we have rook d3 for Gukesh, the rook lift on the 3rd rank, potentially eyeing c3 or b3 with the rook. That is a very aggressive idea, but it turns out this is a very big mistake here. I'm going to give it a question mark, because here, Hikaru Nakamura, he simply goes rook b8, a very strong move, targeting the queen on b4 immediately. And now, as soon as that queen moves, I mean, the attack is going to be virtually over for Gukesh, and here Hikaru is going to be up material with the counterattack coming very swiftly. All right, we have queen to a3. The queen slides out of the attack, and again, keep in mind, Hikaru has the extra piece versus the extra 2 pawns of white, and the longer this game goes, and the more Gukesh doesn't have an attack, the stronger that extra piece will become. All right, here, Hikaru Nakamura, rook b6 is the move. The rook lift on the 6th rank, potentially setting up ideas like queen to b8, potentially, and also putting pressure on that pawn on a6. Overall, a very good move. Now, Gukesh, rook to c3, finding a better square for the rook and pressuring that bishop on c6. Now we have bishop to e4, flying down with the bishop, putting some pressure on e4. And of course, that bishop is, number 1, very, very safe there, and it's also not being attacked on that c6 square. Therefore, this rook is now free to move wherever it needs to. All right, Gukesh, he continues to try to fight back. He goes bishop c4, but this move turns out to be very, very weak. Instead, there were plenty of other stronger ideas. For example, h3, rook d1, and so on. h4, rook d1, and so on. Instead, bishop c4 played in the game. The idea being the bishop potentially is a little more active on c4. It does defend that pawn on a6. But of course, black is going to have several different ideas here to counterattack. Number 1, d5 is very, very strong, driving back that bishop on c4. And the move instead played in the game, knight g6, is also pretty decent, targeting that pawn on the f4 square. Now here, Gukesh, he defends the pawn with the move g3, decent, but again, Hikaru, he simply has the initiative here. Now, in this position, he plays a move that is actually quite strong, but I'm a little bit puzzled by it. He goes king to b8. I mean, to me, the king looked a little bit safer on that a8 square overall, but I guess he's worried about back rank mating ideas, and I guess he wants the king to defend that c8 square instead. Instead of king to b8, the move d5, as usual, was the stronger move, clamping down on that c4 square, driving back that bishop, and potentially threatening the move d4 later in the game. Instead, king b8 was played here, and then we have the move rook d1 for Gukesh, clamping down on that d5 square and capitalizing on potentially the weakness of Hikaru Nakamura's last move. All right, now here, Hikaru, he plays the move queen to c6. Very interesting. The queen is now open to the attack of the rook on c3. For example, if white had a decent discovered attack, that queen would be in a lot of trouble. And it turns out this move queen c6 overall was a big mistake. I'm giving it 2 question marks. Instead, queen to c8, targeting a6 was the better idea. Instead, on c6, the queen is very, very vulnerable. And now white's going to have several different ways to attack it. And in the game, he finds the best move, simply bishop to e2, a very precise retreat of the bishop, opening up the discovered attack on the queen on c6. Now, what is Hikaru going to do here with the queen? Well, he slides the queen all the way back to the a8 square. Queen to a8 played in the game. This is the best retreat square for the queen. But now, Gukesh, he continues. Rook d4, jumping up with the rook. Instead of this, queen to a4 may have been a little bit stronger, eyeing those weak light squares in the black camp. But instead, rook d4 overall, plenty strong. And now the rook is ready to transfer over onto c4, b4, and so on. What is black going to do in this position? Well, he goes rook c8, getting his other rook into the game perfectly fine. Now we have rook dc4. And we do have the possibility for some trades on that c4 square. But before doing that, Hikaru goes rook c to c6. The point being, if white takes on c6, black can take back with the other rook. And now neither side necessarily wants to trade there. Now here, white has a couple of very, very strong ways to proceed. The first one, the strongest one, is simply rook takes c6, and the point is there's a very key tactical idea. If white did this, he didn't do it in the game. If you go rook takes c6, and for example, if black takes back, then queen to a4 puts a lot of pressure on that rook, and overall, white threatens ideas like queen b5. If it moves, queen to e8 could be very dangerous, and overall, black would be close to busted in this position. Instead, after rook c to c6, queen to a5 played immediately. Now, this move is not nearly as strong as taking on c6 immediately, and here Hikaru does get the chance to trade on c4. That is what he does. Rook takes c4, trading that pair of rooks. This is the stronger move. Now we have rook takes c4, and then queen d5, the queen flying into the game, pressuring the rook on c4 and the queen on the a5 square. Now Gukesh, he keeps the queens alive and that rook. Queen to a4 is the move, and now Hikaru, rook to c6, the only good move, again targeting that rook on the c4 square. Now Gukesh, queen b4, hits the king on the b8 square. Black blocks it. Rook to b6 is the move. Now again, we have queen to a4. And here in this position, it's a very, very tense middle game position. But both sides here, they do basically agree to a draw via a 3-fold repetition with the moves rook c6, queen b3, rook b6, queen to a4. A little bit of lag here. Rook c6, queen b3, rook b6, and finally we do have that draw by 3-fold repetition. So very impressive game by Gukesh D and Hikaru Nakamura in this freestyle chess game. Game number 2 underway. We have 2 more games, guys. Don't go anywhere. So it's my first time trying to analyze the games on the fly. I think in the future, I'm going to continue analyzing the games before I do the live stream. Maybe once I start it, we'll have to wait and see. But it is a little too much for me to analyze as I'm going through with the engine. So in the future, I will make sure I do that before starting the game replays. Let's see what you guys are saying here. Scott McConnell. Got a guy writing in, looks like an Arabic language. Thank you, brother. I appreciate it. I'm not sure what he said. Maybe I can translate it. Can I translate that? I don't know if I can translate it. All right, we're going to get ready for game number 3 here. I got 2 more good games for you guys. I'm recording. I'm recording. So we did Magnus versus Hikaru. We did Gukesh versus Hikaru. Let's do some Magnus versus Vincent Keymer. And this game features a queen sacrifice by the GOAT Magnus Carlsen. This will be very interesting, to say the least. All right, I got to get my stuff ready here. Now, Vincent Keymer is a very strong German grandmaster. This guy he's very young. I believe he's only like 20, 21 years old. He's got a very strange opening repertoire for white. He plays a lot of flank openings. He plays maybe more flank openings than anyone else alive as white. It's very interesting. This guy loves his 1 knight f3, 1 c4 stuff. And he plays like the weirdest stuff after that. Let's get a good Vincent Keymer picture. That will do. That will do. There we go. Let's go with the merry tuxedo pick for this game. Yep. Blurry, but I think it'll work. That'll work. All right. What was I missing? Let's see what you guys are saying here before I keep going. All right, no other chats, but feel free to keep chatting. I'll do my best to respond to you guys. And let's keep going here. All right, this third game is Magnus Carlsen versus Vincent Keymer from, again, day number 1 of the 2025 Freestyle Chess Grand Slam Tournament. Let's dive right in. All right, here, Magnus Carlsen is playing as white. Again, Freestyle Chess, all the pieces on very, very strange squares. The top moves, according to the engine here, include... Why does it show black? Something's not right. Oh. Give me 1 sec. All right, in the game, Magnus is playing as white. The top moves here, according to the engine, include 1 d4, 1 a4, 1 f4, and 1 g3, opening up the scope of the light squared bishop. What is Magnus going to do? Well, he ignores all of those moves and instead goes 1 e4, pushing his rook's pawn 2 squares forward. It may be best by test in classical chess, but I'm not so sure about in this position. All right, Vincent Keymer, e5 is the move, playing very, very solid, mimicking white. And here Magnus goes g3, opening up the scope of his light squared bishop, and that could be dangerous later in the game. In fact, so dangerous, black does the exact same thing. 2 g6 played, opening up his bishop as well. Hard to argue with that move from black. Now here Magnus goes b3, potentially intending bishop b2 before this diagonal opens up. It's a very logical choice by the first player. And in fact, Vincent Keymer, he does the exact same thing. He goes b6 here. However, I do want to point out here in this position, instead of b6, turns out b3 is a little bit of a mistake, and black has a few different ways to capitalize on it, including f5, I can draw arrows, f5, and even a5, intending a4 very, very quickly. Instead, b6 played by Vincent Keymer, again playing very solid so far in this game. Now we have bishop b2, bishop b7, very logical stuff. And finally, Magnus does kick things off on the king side with the move f4, very strong, gaining space, threatening e5, and of course, black cannot take on f4, as then you lose the bishop on the h8 square immediately. That would be no bueno. So instead, black here is going to play solid, and he plays the move d6, bolstering that pawn on e5, a perfectly fine move, very reminiscent of many different openings from black's perspective, but beyond that, of course, the move a5, again intending a4, may have been a little bit stronger. Now here, white continues. F takes e5, black takes back with the pawn, d takes e5, and now we have a very interesting, almost reversed Carlsbad-ish structure, pawn structure, reminiscent of the Queen's Gambit Decline exchange variation, or the exchange Caro-Kann, or many other openings. Now here, white continues. Knight to e3, developing his knight, eyeing that very important d5 square, potentially also eyeing f5, discouraging f5 advances from black. Now black does the exact same thing, knight to e6, a perfectly fine move, eyeing those d4 and those f4 squares with that pony. Now white goes d3, bolstering his pawn on e4, a perfectly fine move. And now black does start the active play in the center of the board with the move knight to d4, jumping in with the knight, very strong. Now, of course, white has the option of trading on d4, but you don't want to do that, as then once you lose that dark squared bishop after queen takes d4, black would have a total clamp on the dark squares. That would be simply not fun to play as white. Now here, what should white be doing in this position? According to the engine, moves like bishop g2, c3, a4, and knight c4 are all the top engine choices. Now, none of these moves make a whole lot of sense to me, but that's because this freestyle chess position is just incredibly strange. Now, in the game, knight f3 was chosen by the GOAT, a perfectly fine move, putting pressure on that knight on d4, and of course, also putting a little bit of pressure on that pawn on the e5 square. Black responds, queen d7, getting his queen off the back rank. Then Magnus decides it is time to start the alpha 0 attack on the queen side with the move a4, threatening a5, and that rook is perfectly placed on a1, and that would be very, very dangerous. So with that in mind, black goes a5, clamping down on that square as well, immediately clamping down on that alpha 0 pawn. Now white continues, knight c4, a very good square for the knight, eyeing that e5 square, and Magnus is slowly but surely starting to get a little bit of pressure in this position. And I am starting to quite like his position in this game so far. But here, Vincent Keymer plays the Ben Feingold counterattack f6, bolstering e5, and it turns out f6 is actually the strongest move here. You see this move a lot in, for example, certain lines of the Berlin defense of the Ruy Lopez, when white trades on c6 for the knight, then d takes c6, and then this move f6 is very often played for black, bolstering e5. And so far, again, Vincent has a very solid position. Now here, white tries to imbalance the game. He trades on d4, knight takes d4, Vincent takes back with the e-pawn, e takes d4, and then we have the move bishop f3, the idea being potentially bishop g4, putting pressure on that queen on d7. And of course, you can't really do the idea with bishop g2, as then h3 is not defended by any other piece, and bishop h3 would not be a good idea. So instead, bishop f3, eyeing that g4 square again, putting pressure on the queen on d7. Now here, Vincent, he decides not to block the move. Excuse me, I need some water. All right. And now Vincent, of course, he has a couple of different ways to counterattack that idea by white. You can go f5, blocking the f4, the g4 square with the pawn. You can also go knight h6, guarding the g4 square again with the knight. Instead, in the game though, long castles was played. Long castles, that move looks very strange. One more time. This is just freestyle chess for you. Long castles, very weird. And white does go bishop g4, putting pressure on the queen. Now, of course, f5 is forced if you don't want to lose a rook or the queen. So f5 played in the game. And now bishop h3. Magnus, he achieves what he wants. He gets his bishop on this diagonal, opposing the black queen and the king, and then he just drops back, knowing that pawn on f5 is now permanently pinned to the queen on d7. He drops back and maintains the tension, a very typical Magnus Carlsen style move. Now black goes knight f6, developing his knight. Now white trades on f5. E takes f5, then we have g takes f5, and then simply the move rook to f1, sliding the rook over out of the attack of the black rook on e8 and pressuring that pawn on f5. Now, of course, bishop takes f5 is a very, very real threat. What is black going to do about it? He goes knight g4, trying to clog up this diagonal, but this move wasn't really necessary. Instead, you could just go king to b8 on the prior move. For example, right here, king to b8 would be just fine. And yes, white can win that pawn on f5, but you keep the queen, and overall, you do have a very good, very solid position as black. Instead, in the game, knight g4 was chosen, and the problem with this move, this is a serious tactical blunder. White has a beautiful tactical shot right here in this position. If you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the key idea for black in this position. And while you're at it, go and smash that YouTube like button for more videos just like this. All right, here, of course, Magnus, he puts his thinking cap on. And he sees the key idea. Rook takes f5, giving up the rook. The point being, if you take the rook, then you take on g4 with the bishop, and then the queen is pinned to the king on c8, and that would be all she wrote. Of course, Vincent Keymer, he has an idea here. He jumps down with the knight, knight to f2. What in the world is the idea behind this move? It's very simple. You're targeting that bishop on h3. Now, if you take the knight, then you lose the bishop, and overall black will still be in the game, and that is what happened here. So we have rook takes f2, then queen takes h3, sliding down with the queen, winning that bishop, and yes, here Magnus is up a single pawn. He has the extra g pawn. However, you do want to point out these bishops on h8 and b7 are very active. Black has good rooks, a safe king, a very active queen, and while the computer does like white here, to be honest, I actually almost prefer black's game as he has so much activity here. All right, white continues, king to a2, a surprising but very good move, opening up this line of attack to get into the game for the rook on the a1 square. Now black goes bishop g7, potentially intending bishop h6 and then to e3. That would be a very strong idea. Now white goes queen to f1, offering that queen trade. Of course, Vincent Keymer, he must keep those queens on the board. If those queens come off the board, then his position will kind of collapse immediately, as again, white's extra pawn will be a huge asset in the endgame. With that in mind, queen to e6 played by the German grandmaster, sliding back with the queen, keeping the queens on the board. Now we have bishop c1 for Magnus, rerouting his bishop to a much better square, a good idea. Now it does have access to, say, g5, f4, and so on. And beyond that, you're also discouraging the idea of bishop h6 from black. So overall, a good multi-purpose move. Now black continues bishop d5, putting pressure on that knight on c4. And now bishop takes c4 is a real threat, as no matter how white takes back, his pawn structure on the queen side would be damaged permanently. So that will be something to watch out for later in this game. All right, white continues. Bishop d2, opening up the idea of potentially rook a to e1, skewering the king and the rook behind it on the e8 square. That would be very good for white. Excuse me, one sec. We're back. All right, Vincent Keymer, he sees this. He slides his queen off the open e-file. He goes queen to c6, sliding over with that queen. Now we have queen to h3. Magnus giving the king a check on the c8 square. The king must move or he must block it. And in the game, Vincent, rook d7 was the response, blocking the check. It turns out that is the right response here from black. Now, of course, one of the ideas of queen to h3, you're hitting the king, but you're also hitting that weak pawn on h7. And should white take that pawn in this position? Well, it turns out it is not the best idea, but Magnus, he goes for it anyway. He actually goes queen takes h7. Now, instead of that, moves like rook to e1 and queen to h5, targeting that weak rook on e8 were the stronger ideas. Instead, queen takes h7 played in the game, and now the queen is quite vulnerable on that h7 square, and here black has a very simple response to gain the initiative in this game. It is simply rook to h8, hitting the queen, forcing something like queen to f5, and from there, rook to f8 again hits the queen, and you're doing excellent. Instead, though, Vincent, he doesn't spot the idea of rook to h8. Instead, bishop takes c4 played in the game, and I like the idea behind this. You are trying to soften up that queen side. However, here, it turns out it's actually not the right idea. Now, very importantly, which pawn should white take back with? The b pawn or the d pawn? It's not as simple as it looks at first glance. Obviously, if you take back with the b pawn, then the pawn on a4 will be lost, but it turns out that is not such a big deal. Instead, if you take back with the d pawn, then black can go d3, opening up the scope of this bishop, and that would be way more dangerous. So with that in mind here, Magnus, he calculates everything out, and he goes b takes c4, recapturing with the b pawn. That is the much stronger idea. Excuse me. Some water. All right, now black swoops in, captures that pawn on a4. Queen takes a4 played in the game. King b2 is the response. Then queen to c6 dropping back. Now, it may look kind of strange. The king on b2 is very naked. We have these open files on the a file and the b file. But it turns out that white king on b2, surprisingly, is actually pretty safe. Now here, Magnus, he continues rook to e1, activating his rook, opposing the black rook on the e8 square. A perfectly fine move. Now we have rook takes e1, then bishop takes e1, and then king to b7, getting off that back rank and supporting that queen on c6. Overall, a decent move. But keep in mind, Magnus here, he is up material. He is up a single pawn, and even more importantly, he has two protected passed pawns on the queen side, the king side, sorry, away from the kings, and that is a huge advantage. All right, white continues rook to e2, getting the rook over onto the e file and opening up f2 for the bishop if it needs it. Now we have king to a7, the king slides over, then queen to e4, Magnus offering the queen trade, and of course, Magnus is the greatest endgame player of all time. You don't want to go into an endgame down a pawn against Magnus if you don't have to. So with that in mind, he keeps the game going. Queen to c5 is the move, keeping those queens on the board. Then queen to e8, sorry. The queen flies back, very strong, targeting that rook on d7. Now we have rook to d6. Vincent trying to defend the best he can. Queen to c8 is now the move. Sorry, queen to c8, sliding over with the queen, targeting the pawn on c7. Now we have bishop to f6, sliding up with the bishop, and then rook to e8, flying back to the back rank. And now the threat is simply queen to a8. That would be checkmate on the spot. Therefore, queen c6 is forced, guarding a8 with the queen, and now bishop d2, potentially eyeing f4 with the bishop. Now black goes rook d7, getting out of the way in advance of the attack of the bishop going to the f4 square. But now, sure enough, bishop f4 happens anyway. And look at this. All of Magnus Carlsen's pieces are so active here. The queen and the rook on the back rank. The bishop slicing down on c7, and black, what can he do? All of his pieces are just passively defending right now. It's amazing how in all of Magnus Carlsen's games, he always seems to get positions just like this with all of his pieces on perfect squares and all of his opponent's pieces on terrible squares. It's amazing how it always happens. All right, now black continues. Bishop e7, sliding back with the bishop. Then we have queen to b8, hitting the king on a7. The king must move. King to a6 played in the game. Then queen to a8. This virtually forces the queens to come off the board. Now the queen takes a8, rook takes a8, king to b7. That is forced, and then rook to e8. And now here we have an endgame again, where white has those two extra passed pawns on the queen side. Is there anything black can do to try and hang on here? Let's find out. Well, the only asset black really has here is that pawn on the a5 square. He is going to push it immediately. a4 is the move. Of course, the a3 square is covered by the bishop. Therefore, a3 will come sooner or later. White goes h4, getting his passed pawn rolling down the board. Now we have bishop to b4, then h5, then rook to f7, pressuring the bishop, stopping g4 ideas, and then here h6 for white. All the pawns on the king side are perfectly defended. White is doing excellent. Vincent Keymer, again, what can he possibly do to hold this game? He tries king to c6, bringing his king over. Then we have rook to e4, sliding down with the rook, pressuring the weak pawn on d4. Then bishop c3 hits the king on b2. The king must move. a3 chosen in the game, king to a3, and then b5. Vincent again defending a4. The idea being if white takes on b5, you recapture with the king and you are hanging on. Now white goes rook to e6, jumping up with the rook, pressuring that king on c6, then king to d7. The king slides back, then rook g6, sliding over with the rook, and then finally Vincent, he knows if you sit around and wait, rook g7 is coming. That would be effectively game over on the spot. Therefore, Vincent tries to get something going on the queen side. He goes b4, giving up the pawn on a4. The idea being maybe that rook can reroute to a8, trying to defend, and that is what happens. King takes a4, rook to f8, but then here Magnus, he knows the idea is simply rook a8, and with that in mind, rook to a6 was played by the goat, shutting that down. Now we have rook to e8, and now one final move to seal the deal. That is the move h7. And here in this position, Vincent Keymer, he resigns on the spot to the GOAT, Magnus Carlsen. And here is why. If you try to defend with the rook, say rook to h8, white just goes rook h6, followed by bishop d4, hitting the rook and forcing that pawn back anyway. Overall, white will be winning here. So for that reason, in this position, after rook to a6, rook e8, h7, black simply resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen. Wow, what a game between Vincent Keymer and Magnus Carlsen in day number 1 of the 2025 Freestyle Chess Tournament Grand Slam. Very impressive stuff. All right, let's see what the chat says. No new chats, guys. Comment in the chat if you guys want. I'm still going live here. I got one more game for you. One more game for today. So this final game is Vladimir Fedoseev versus Magnus Carlsen. We got to get our things set up here. play any music. One sec, guys. All right, Vladimir Fedoseev. 739. So for anyone just joining, I am setting up the next games we're going to go through here. This last one is Vladimir Fedoseev versus Magnus Carlsen. It's going to be a good one. I think I'm pretty much ready here. All right, guys, give me one minute here. You are welcome, Ahmed Amin. Magnus Carlsen is the GOAT. Yes, he is. But is he the freestyle chess GOAT? I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. I think he will be. I think him and Hikaru will be like, still be top two in freestyle. But, you know, freestyle is different. So we'll have to wait and see. There's a lot more randomness to it, which is interesting. All right, guys, give me 1 minute. I will be right back. And we're going to go through the last game here. All right. All right. All right. All right. Let's see. Check the chat. Nothing new. Feel free to comment, guys. If you want me to respond to your comments, just comment there and I'll get back to you on whatever it is that you're... I can make a goal. What's a goal? How will I celebrate? I'll sure, let's set a goal. What's the chess app name? Define proper chess. This is play all over the world. Chess.com? Oh, Magnus has the Take app. Maybe that's it. I mean, there's plenty of apps to play online. But all right, I'll get back to your chats after this last game. We're going to dive into this here. Everything ready? Fedoseev, Magnus, and by the way, this is the Queen Sacrifice game. It's a little bit shorter of a game. It's wild. Magnus, as usual, is the one sacrificing the Queen. So yeah, this will be a good one. All right, here we go in the game. Of course, it's freestyle chess, so white has the king on f1, his rook's in between, and all the other pieces on really bizarre squares, and this really is a bizarre opening position. Here the computer says moves like c3 are actually the strongest moves here. Instead, white goes c4, gaining space immediately on the queen side in the spirit of the English opening. Now, how is black going to respond? Well, he goes 1b6, opening up the scope of his queen, and now of course if white goes g3 or g4, he loses the rook on the h1 square immediately, so that was part of the idea here. But of course this move does not fight for the center of the board, and now Vladimir does go d4, gaining space. He's got his pawns on c4 and d4, and of course Magnus doing very little to fight for the center so far. He continues knight to f6, controlling e4, or at least trying to, and now white goes knight to f3, and now finally Magnus does break in the center of the board with the move d5, opening up the game sort of in the spirit of the Grunfeld opening, kind of, sort of. What's going to happen from here? Well, it turns out the strongest way forward for white is c5, gaining even more space. Instead, he does take on d5. C takes d5, not a bad move. Now, normally in regular chess, when you take on d5, that knight can go to c3, hitting the queen if the queen takes back, but there is no knight c3 move available here. Therefore, queen takes d5 is quite a good move for black, and the queen is pretty well centralized, and there's no easy way to fight back against it. All right, Vladimir, he continues knight d3, centralizing his knight, guarding the c5 and the e5 squares. Not a bad move at all. And black here continues c5, gaining space on the queen side, and of course, chomping down on that weak pawn on d4 of Vladimir Fedoseev. All right, now the Russian Grandmaster Vladimir, how does he continue? He takes on c5. That is the only good move, in fact, right here. D takes c5 chosen in the game, and then we have B takes c5, recapturing towards the center, but in the process damaging his own pawn structure. A very provocative idea by the GOAT Magnus Carlsen. All right, now Vladimir, he plays a shocking move, b4, the wing gambit style move, opening up the scope of the queen on the long diagonal and also pressuring c5. And if you take on b4, the knight takes back, hits the queen, and white is doing potentially very, very well. Now here black does take on b4, c takes b4, and white recaptures with the bishop. Bishop takes b4, pinning the pawn on e7 to the king on the f8 square. Now here black does castle short. It's a very weird looking move. Here we go. Castles short, sliding the king over one square and the rook to the other side of it, of course, getting the king and the rook on their normal castling short squares, as in normal chess. All right, now here, Vladimir, he spots the problem with this move, castle short. I'm giving it 2 question marks. He simply goes knight to b2, and here's the problem. How do you defend both the queen and the rook on d8? You don't. If you move the queen literally anywhere, you lose the rook. The only square that could defend it is a5, but then you lose the queen on the spot. And therefore here, Magnus Carlsen, he is forced to sacrifice his queen for the rook and the knight. Here we go. Queen takes d1, knight takes d1, and then rook takes d1. Now overall, Magnus is down the queen for the rook and the knight. Of course, that is going to massively benefit the first player, Vladimir. I have no idea why Magnus went for this line, starting with short castles, eventually leading to the queen sacrifice. I have no idea. Don't ask me why he did that, but here we are. Magnus just has a penchant for queen sacrifices, I guess. All right, bishop e1 chosen in the game, blocking the attack of the rook on the king. Now we have the move bishop to a4, flying down with the bishop and defending the rook on d1 immediately. Excuse me. Of course, this move is not that scary, and white has several different ways to combat it. One is queen b2, targeting the bishop on b8, and the other is actually short castles as played in the game. So, short castles is the move. The king slides over, the rook slides over, and now that bishop on e1 is more than defended. The king on e1 is perfectly safe, and Magnus here is close to busted already out of the opening. All right, he goes e5, gaining space in the center. The goat is fighting back. Now we have queen b2, sure enough, again targeting that weak bishop on the b8 square. Now Magnus, instead of defending it, he actually goes e4, counterattacking against the knight on f3. Now here, white has the option of taking the bishop, allowing black to take on f3, but he decides, you know what, I am so far ahead, there is simply no need to go for those complications. With that in mind, knight to d2 is the move, dropping back with the knight, pressuring e4 with the knight and the bishop, and of course, you are still targeting the weak bishop on b8. Now black, he goes knight b6, blocking the attack on the bishop, and of course, defending it with the rook on f8, but this means white has the chance to win yet more material, that being the pawn on e4, and he wins it immediately. So, knight takes e4, then knight takes, then bishop takes, and now, of course, that rook on d1 is starting to get a little bit vulnerable. All right, black continues, rook e8, targeting the white bishop on e4, and Vladimir just goes bishop d3, trying to trap the rook on the d1 square. Now the rook has almost nowhere to go. Literally anywhere you move it to, it would be captured immediately. Of course, with the bishop on a4 and the knight defending it, the rook on d1 for now is safe, but overall, that is one dangerous rook. All right, bishop e5 is the move by Magnus, targeting the queen on b2. Where is the queen going to go? Well, it's not going anywhere. Here, Vladimir finds a very simple move to simplify. He just goes bishop c3. Now, the idea being we are going to have lots of pieces flying off the board. For example, we have bishops coming off the board, and also these rooks on d1 and f1 are also coming off, and the more pieces that come off the board, the more important white's material advantage will be in this game. So, bishop takes c3 is the move for the goat, then queen takes c3, then we have rook c8, targeting the queen before moving that rook on d1. Now we have the move queen b2, sliding back with the queen, and then finally rook takes f1, and then king takes f1. Now let's slow down and do inventory. In this position right here, white still has the extra queen versus the knight and rook, but he also has an extra pawn. And overall, there is very little black can do against white in this kind of position. His queen is just way too strong, as is the extra pawn. All right, Magnus, he continues, g6, trying to cut down on the scope of that light squared bishop. And now we have the move f3 for Vladimir, potentially intending e4, maybe king f2. Overall, a solid move. He can kind of do whatever he wants and still win here. All right, bishop d7 for Magnus, dropping back with the bishop. Then we have g4, gaining space on the king side. Very interesting. Now, bishop e6, and Vladimir shows he is not content to slowly grind out a win in the endgame. He wants to win right here, right now, and he goes for it with the Alpha Zero style move h4. Now, this move is so dangerous. White is potentially threatening h5, then h6, and then queen g7. And that may look like an excuse me. And that may look like an I can't talk. And that may be oversimplifying things, but overall, Black's position is very edgy. White has the very simple Alpha Zero idea, and how is Black going to stop it? Well, he tries rook to c5. The idea being, if White goes h5, then g takes, then rook takes, will win that pawn on the spot. Now we have queen to a3, targeting the rook and sliding over to a different diagonal with the queen, and of course, also targeting a7 with the queen, not just the rook. So rook c7 defends the rook and the pawn on the a7 square. Then king to f2 gets the king off the back rank. And again, Vladimir has everything under control here. The queen sacrifice for Magnus has not worked out so far in this game. All right, knight d5, centralizing the knight. Then we have queen d6, flying in with the queen, pressuring literally all of Black's pieces here. Now rook d7 hits the queen, and everything is defended for now. Then we have queen b8, hits the king, king g7, queen e5, king g8, and here, Vladimir, the final move of the game, very fitting, one of my favorite moves on the chessboard, simply h5. The Alpha Zero pawn decides the game, and now Black has almost no defense against the idea of h6, and then again, queen g7. And again, if you go f6, the Ben Feingold counterattack, trying to block this diagonal, you simply lose the bishop on e6. And overall, Magnus here, he's had enough. He is done, and he simply resigns on the spot to Vladimir Fedoseev. He's not playing any more moves in this game. So very impressive game between Vladimir Fedoseev and Magnus Carlsen in this freestyle chess Grand Slam tournament. Of course, the queen sacrifice for Magnus, starting with the move short castles. I don't know if he missed the idea of knight b2 or if he thought it wasn't strong. Anyway, you look at it, knight b2 played in the game, then queen takes, knight takes, and then finally rook takes, and that was the beginning of the end for Magnus, as he was forced to do that, giving up the queen, as otherwise you lose the rook on d8. So very impressive game overall. Woo! All right, that is all for today. Let's see what the chat says here. Oh, wrong thing. No more chats, guys. So I'll stick around for another minute if you guys want to talk to me about anything, and then I'll wrap this up, and then we will, post these games as individual videos as well. That is the plan. So I'm gonna try to start going live each day if you guys like this. So let's see. I might try to go live around 12 p.m. Eastern time if that works for you guys. And yeah, I'll be doing this daily. So if you guys don't have questions, I am going to end the live stream. So comment in the comments box if you guys have any questions, anything you want to ask. It looks like that is it. So thank you to, I'll read off all the names here. Itachi, thank you Scott McLaughlin, thank you Mohammad Reza Afshari, thank you to, I can't pronounce that, I don't read Arabic, but there's a name in Arabic here. It sounds like Amhat Maneba. If that's you, thank you. Thank you Ahmad Amin. Thank you Taboho Saisa. I hope I said it right. Thank you, Z-Balds. And yeah, Sinister Magnus. Brilliant to lose the way he did. Yeah, that's great. That is a fantastic way to put it. You know, I don't know if Magnus knew that castling short was bad, or if he saw it was bad and went to it anyway just to sacrifice the queen. He plays a lot of queen sacrifices. He's got a weakness for that. So I'm like 50-50 if he did that on purpose or if it was a mistake. I don't know. Sacking it for nothing. Yeah, Deboho Saisa, yeah, sacking it for nothing was brutal. Yeah, thank you, Ahmed. I'm in. I'm going to keep going live each day, and I'm going to repost these games as individual videos. So it's for the past like few months, I've been doing maybe 2 to 3 videos per day. It's going to be the same thing, just all the videos covered in a live stream. And in the future, I'm going to analyze the games beforehand and have like better commentary and whatnot, like I usually do, and then repost them anyway following the live stream. So that is the plan. Hope you guys enjoyed it. It looks like that is all the comments for today. So I'm going to wrap this up. But thank you to everyone who came here. And again, I'll be doing it pretty similar time every single day. So keep coming back and I'll keep responding to you guys. And I'm also going to start live streaming very soon my own games. So I'm going to start playing my own games online while live streaming in the very near future. Hopefully you guys enjoy that. But that is all for today. So I will see you tomorrow.